Alrighty, guys, welcome back. So we had a great conversation yesterday about ecology and about how things interact. That is the whole idea of what we're talking about here. When we talk about this unit, we're talking about looking at an ecosystem. Whoops, sorry, I'm making the video more and more lopsided. There we go. We're talking about how an ecosystem, the place where you live, how different roles come into effect and how things interact with each other. That's what ecology is all about, is interaction. So we're going to talk about today some different roles and some kind of key terms that we want to make sure that we understand in ecology. And we'll continue practicing with these. We'll probably do a Quizlet live on Thursday's Zoom, so you have that to look forward to. But it's interesting because you can think about ecology as like a society in a way. So thinking about just the time that we're living in, it really brings to the forefront how many different jobs we depend on, right? And even things that you don't think that you maybe depend on, you do. So for example, toilet paper, right? That was not something that at the beginning of 2020 that I thought was going to be a big struggle, was finding toilet paper. But it's these small little things that if you have one thing, it's kind of like the domino effect. You hit one domino, it hits the one after it and the one after it and the one after it. Same thing with ecology. And a lot of it has to do with understanding the roles that different organisms play. So looking over at this picture here, we have an ecosystem and you can see all these different things, right? So starting at the bottom here, you have these tiny microscopic organisms that provide food for the fish, and some of them may be photosynthesized, so they can create sugars. They provide food for the fish, which can provide food for other animals. Like, that's not an insect. I don't know why it's labeled as an insect, but things like that, like frogs, whatever, all sorts of things. And then you have things over here that break down dead and decaying material. They all have a really important role in regulating that environment. Even things that may seem similar can actually, what we call, kind of divide up an environment. So look over at the other picture. So this is a coastal region, and all of them are birds, types of birds that you would think have a similar role, like they would compete. But what they do instead is they find a specific thing that they're really, really good at, and they basically become specialists in that area. So what we call, a special word that we use to call all these different jobs, the different way that an organism interacts, is called its niche. It's spelled like that. Okay, so a niche is basically an organism's job in how it interacts with its environment. So for example, you can be a carnivore, but the way you hunt also goes into that niche. So for example, something like a specialist, like an anteater, that is super, super specialized in, getting those ants out, getting termites or something like that. That's a niche, right? It finds its place in its environment. And when we have invasive species, introduced species, sometimes those niches, they have to adapt. So let's go ahead and kind of get into some other definitions that you need to know, some other roles that you should probably know for this unit. Okay, so some key terms that you need to know, and some of these you probably or maybe know already. First one is a producer. So a producer is going to be any organism that does not need to eat. It can produce its own food. And it does this by converting energy. So you're converting energy back and forth between something that is going to be inorganic, like light, into something that is more organic, like sugar. So for example, in 99% of the cases, especially when we're talking in this class, we're talking about plants. However, we can also be talking about bacteria sometimes, and other kinds of protists that can actually convert energy. Anything that can photosynthesize is going to be a producer. They do not need to eat. They can produce their own food. And they're also called autotrophs, meaning they can feed themselves. That's what that word literally means. But another example here is actually going to be at the very, very bottom of the ocean. At the bottom of the ocean, there's actually an entire food chain where light does not exist. So you have to have producers down there. So instead, what they do is they take the energy from some of the chemicals that come off of those hot vents, and they convert that energy into a sugar that then bigger animals can go and eat. So that's why you have strange wildlife that exists at the bottom of the ocean. Fun fact. All right, cool. Now, the opposite of a producer would be something called a consumer. So a consumer is any organism that cannot make its own food, something that has to either find its food by eating the plant or hunting or any of that kind of stuff. That would be a consumer. So animals are going to fall under the consumer because we cannot make our own food. Different types of consumers, though, that you might have heard of. You have carnivores, those eat only plants. Herbivores, carnivores eat only animals. I don't know what I'm thinking. Herbivores eat only plants, and omnivores eat both. And a lot of the times, the way that we can tell which one it is actually due to their teeth. So if you're looking at just a random animal and you're trying to figure out what it does and what kind of things it likes to eat, looking at its teeth can be a big hint. So for example, looking at carnivores, this is going to be a carnivore skull. That is, I believe, probably some type of dog. It looks like a canine of some sort. But if you look at its teeth, it has really big teeth here, and they're really sharp and pointed. I won't get into too much of the technical terms here, but if you look here, their teeth are especially going to be specialized for tearing and chewing and things like that. Now, canines can, they're not strictly carnivores. They can eat some other kinds of like plants and things like that, which is what you see on like dog food packaging. They do need a little bit of that. But it's a good example looking at the teeth here compared to something that is definitely an herbivore. So this one is going to be all herbivore. So look at the difference in those teeth. The back teeth, these molars and things like that, they're going to be for grinding. So you can kind of grind the grass, and you have teeth at the front here, which you can use to kind of tear the leaves off of a surface. Then this is a bear skull right here. Bears are like the perfect example for an omnivore because they need both. And actually their diet differs based on what time of the year it is. So when it's earlier in the summer, they're a little bit less aggressive, bears are, because they're mostly looking for plants. But then as it gets closer and closer to the time that they need to hibernate, they get more and more agitated. They need to get that calorie count up high so that they have enough energy to store up when they hibernate. And so that's when they start eating more meat. But you can see here you have a little bit of both. So you have big teeth that look like they could be used for tearing, but then you also have in the front and in the back some teeth that could be used for more herbivorous herbivore activities. And then finally, in every ecosystem, you usually need some sort of decomposer. Now, an example of a decomposer would be things like mushrooms are great examples, certain types of insects, worms, things that are going to break down dead and decaying organisms are going to be decomposers. And these are essential. They basically are able to recycle some of that dead and decaying material and break it down into parts and chemicals that different organisms are going to need, different bacteria is going to need to make sure that the soil has good quality, that your plants can uptake some of those vitamins and different basically chemicals. So those are some of those are the first kind of big three roles that everything is going to fit into. But what we talked about in the Zoom yesterday, I want to also highlight again, how do these species interact? So we have these different roles, but when you have different jobs in a society, different roles, you can also see some interesting relationships form. So I'm going to go over those one more time as well. Okay. So we also see interspecies behavior. So interspecies means between two different species. So when things interact, when they have different niches in the same environment, in the same ecosystem, we can see some interesting relationships form. And we talked about this yesterday in the Zoom, so this is a little bit of a review. First one is going to be commensalism. So commensalism is when one species is going to benefit and the other one kind of gets nothing, it's not really harmed, but it's also not a benefit either. So for example, here we have this cattle here, and you have a bird that is sitting on top of it. The bird gets a free ride, and it gets to pick the insects off of our little herbivore friend there. But the cow doesn't seem to mind. It doesn't really care. You see this with a lot of herbivores, a lot of grazing animals. The birds will kind of hang out, and they'll just kind of pick up the leftovers. So that would be commensalism. So it's not harmed, it's not benefiting anything on one side, but one of them is getting benefit. So that's a relationship there. Mutualism is going to be a little bit different. Mutualism happens when both species benefit from the relationship. So, example here, the clownfish and the anemone. So basically, the clownfish gets a good home because basically this anemone is going to be poisonous. So it's poisonous to most other fish. And it actually kind of uses that to its advantage. So when a fish gets nearby, it'll use that to basically trap it. It paralyzes its prey, and then it breaks it down slowly. The clownfish can actually lure other fish into it, and it can help clean up pieces that it's not going to digest. So both of them really get something good out of that relationship. Other examples of mutualism have to do any kind of plant and a pollinator. So like butterflies and things like that. The butterfly gets a meal, and the plant gets to get pollinated and basically spread that pollen around. Competition. So competition is when two species compete for the same niche. So example, lion and hyena, right? They're both carnivores in the same kind of biome. And sometimes they can butt heads. And actually it's going to be negative because both species notice kind of a decrease in the amount of things that are available to them. They're both going to have to kind of work harder. Their food source is eliminated, getting smaller. That pool is getting smaller because there's competition for the same resources. Then finally, you have these last two. They're both going to be kind of the same, where one of them is going to get a positive and the other one is going to get a negative. And predator-prey has to do with they're both kind of similar, but predator-prey is going to be something like hunting, or it's going to be grazing if you're an herbivore, but you're looking to the ecosystem to get your food. So one of them is going to probably die, or at least be heavily injured. Parasitism is going to be when one of them kind of feeds off of a host. So you have like a host relationship. So fleas and dogs would be an example there. And one of them benefits from the other one. They either use that host for food or for reproduction. So they can lay eggs in the host sometimes, or on the host. But both, one of them is going to be harmed and the other one is going to be getting a net benefit from that relationship. So those are kind of the main ways that different species are going to interact with each other. So I hope you guys got some good definitions out of this, and feel free to pause, go back and take notes, because these definitions will be important both for your weekly quiz and for your Zoom. We'll review a little bit tomorrow. All right, guys, have a great day. Bye.